The air in the Luzon jungle, thick and heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, had changed. The percussive rhythm of artillery and the crackle of rifle fire, the soundtrack to Akiko Tanaka's life for 3 years, had been replaced by an unnerving silence. On August 15, 1945, a garbled radio broadcast, crackling with static, had delivered the Emperor's voice. It was a voice no one had ever heard, announcing a reality no one had ever conceived: surrender. For Akiko, a nurse with the Imperial Japanese Army, the world had not just ended, it had inverted. The concept of becoming a prisoner was a stain so profound it was barely comprehensible, a fate worse than the honorable death she had been prepared to meet. Now, weeks later, that stain was her reality. She and the other surviving nurses and female aides from their field hospital had been rounded up by American soldiers. The journey was a blur of humiliation. They were herded onto canvas-covered trucks, the very vehicles they once targeted, and driven through villages where Filipino faces watched them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Akiko kept her eyes fixed on the wooden floor, her spine ramrod straight, a futile attempt to retain a shred of the dignity that had been stripped from her, along with her service pistol and medical kit. Beside her, young Yumi Sato trembled, her eyes wide with a terror Akiko refused to show. "They will treat us like animals, Akiko-san," Yumi whispered, her voice barely audible over the truck's engine. "We are nurses of the Emperor's army," Akiko replied, her tone colder than she intended. "We will endure. Do not show them your fear." But as the truck rolled to a stop inside a hastily constructed compound of barbed wire and canvas tents, Akiko's own resolve frayed. The American guards, tall and loose-limbed in their olive-drab uniforms, observed them with an unnerving casualness. One of them, a sergeant with tired eyes and a helmet pushed back on his head, directed them toward a segregated section of the camp. His name, they would learn, was Sergeant Miller. He didn't shout. He didn't smile. He just pointed. His commands filtered through a nervous Japanese-American interpreter. As they were marched toward a row of empty tents, the finality of their situation settled like a shroud. They were no longer soldiers or nurses. They were prisoners, numbers on a list, their fate resting in the hands of the men they had been taught to view as demons. Life in the POW camp settled into a rhythm of oppressive monotony. The days were measured by the sun's relentless climb, the meager meals of rice and canned fish, and the endless, suffocating waiting. Dust was everywhere, in their food, their water, the folds of their Monpe work trousers. At night, the jungle, once a place of cover, became a source of menacing sounds. Akiko threw herself into a routine, attempting to maintain discipline among the handful of women in her tent. She led them in morning stretches and insisted on keeping their small space as clean as possible, small acts of defiance against the encroaching despair. The American guards were a constant, dispassionate presence. Sergeant Miller, who oversaw their section, was a man of few words. He would stand by the wire smoking a cigarette, his gaze distant. He wasn't cruel, but his utter lack of engagement was itself a form of psychological pressure. He was a wall, an embodiment of their captivity. Rumors, fed by fear, spread through the women's quarters like a virus. Tales of other camps, of interrogations, of women separated from the main groups and never seen again. Yumi was particularly susceptible. "I heard the Americans are sending women to work in their officer clubs," she'd whisper to Akiko after dark. "They are looking for the young ones." "They are just stories, Yumi," Akiko would counter, her voice firm. "Propaganda, we were told. We must trust in the protocols of war." But even as she said it, a cold knot would tighten in her stomach. Did she believe it? She had seen the savagery of this war. Why should its end be any different? One sweltering afternoon, Sergeant Miller appeared at their tent, accompanied by the interpreter. He didn't look at them directly, instead focusing on a point just over their heads. "All female personnel," the interpreter announced, his voice flat. "Assemble at the large medical tent in 1 hour. No exceptions." A current of panic shot through the group. The medical tent was a place of mystery. No one had been inside. Why now? Why just the women? As Miller turned and walked away, his boots kicking up clouds of yellow dust, Yumi grabbed Akiko's arm, her knuckles white. "This is it, Akiko-san," she breathed. "It's what the rumors said." Akiko said nothing, but as she watched the sergeants retreating back, the wall of her composure began to crack. The casual, almost bureaucratic nature of the order was more terrifying than any open threat. The interior of the medical tent was stark white, a shocking contrast to the dusty brown of the camp. It smelled of antiseptic and canvas. A dozen women, including Akiko and a deathly pale Yumi, stood clustered together on a ground sheet, their bare feet cold against the material. The air was thick with a silent, collective dread. There were no examination tables, no medical equipment in sight. There were only 2 American guards by the entrance flap, and, at the far end of the tent, Sergeant Miller, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch, his eyes scanning the group. Akiko forced herself to meet his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of her family in Kagoshima, of her duty, of the small, sharp blade she had failed to conceal. Her mind raced, cataloging the worst possibilities, each more terrible than the last. This is the moment, she thought, where honor is tested. Finally, Miller gave a curt nod to the interpreter. The interpreter cleared his throat, his own nervousness apparent. He avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the tent pole. "By order of the Allied Command Public Health Office," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "you will prepare for a mandatory health inspection." There was a slight collective exhale. A health inspection. It was clinical, manageable, but the relief was premature. Sergeant Miller took a step forward, his voice cutting through the interpreters. It was not a shout, but a low, firm command that needed no translation. He gestured sharply toward their legs. "Take them off," he ordered. The interpreter, looking ill, relayed the message. You must remove your trousers. All of you. Now." A wave of pure shock silenced the tent. It was followed by a ripple of horrified gasps. Remove their monpe? In front of these men? It was an unthinkable violation, a stripping away of the final layer of their identity and dignity. This wasn't a medical inspection. It was a prelude to something monstrous. Yumi began to sob quietly, her body shaking. Akiko felt a surge of white-hot fury. She stared at Sergeant Miller, her eyes blazing with defiance. He did not flinch. "I will not repeat myself," he said, his hand moving Jajawab to rest on the butt of his sidearm, a gesture of authority, not threat. The message was clear. They had no choice. Slowly, with trembling hands and downcast eyes, the women began to untie the drawstrings of their trousers. The rustle of fabric was the only sound. Humiliation washed over Akiko, hot and acidic. She closed her eyes, her mind a storm of shame and terror, as she complied. They stood there in their thin undergarments, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the inevitable, horrifying next command. The moment stretched into an eternity. The women stood frozen, a tableau of shame and fear, bracing for the worst. The 2 guards at the entrance shifted their feet, pointedly looking away. Even Sergeant Miller seemed uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the canvas wall. The air in the tent was a suffocating mix of unspoken terror and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Akiko's mind was eerily calm, a detached observer of her own degradation. She was ready to fight, to scream, to die. Then the tent flap was pulled back. But it wasn't more soldiers who entered. It was an American woman in a crisp white nurse's uniform, her hair tied back neatly. Behind her came another man, an officer with captain's bars on his collar, who Akiko recognized as Captain Evans, a medical doctor she had seen from a distance. The nurse carried a wooden crate. Captain Evans surveyed the scene with a clinical, almost impatient eye. He ignored the women's state of undress and spoke directly to Sergeant Miller. "Are the delousing units ready, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. The powder is ready to be applied to the garments." The captain then turned his attention to the prisoners, speaking English while the interpreter hurried to keep up. "There has been a significant outbreak of epidemic typhus in a camp to the north. General MacArthur's headquarters has issued a non-negotiable directive: mandatory delousing and screening of all POWs and internees to prevent a pandemic." He gestured to the American nurse. "This is Nurse Stevens. You will form a single-file line. She will conduct a brief medical check on each of you for lice and symptoms of the disease." He then pointed to the pile of discarded Monpi trousers. "Your garments are being taken to be treated with DDT powder. You will get them back in 1 hour." The next command, the one they had been dreading, had come. And it was utterly, terrifyingly mundane. Relief washed over Akiko so suddenly it left her weak-kneed. It was not an attack. It was sanitation. It was not about power or violation in the way she had feared, but about a different, colder kind of power. The power of bureaucracy and disease prevention. The humiliation was still there, a bitter taste in her mouth, but the terror was gone, replaced by a bewildering sense of absurdity. They had been stripped of their dignity not out of malice, but out of a fear of lice. As Nurse Stevens began her work, her touch firm but professional, Akiko looked at the pile of their trousers being carried out by a guard. War, she realized, had a logic all its own, and it was often more bizarre and impersonal than the most vivid propaganda. In the weeks that followed, the incident in the medical tent was never spoken of, but it lingered. Life in the camp returned to its dusty, monotonous rhythm, but something had shifted for Akiko. The enemy was no longer a one-dimensional monster. It was a system. It was Sergeant Miller, doing a job he clearly disliked. It was Captain Evans, fighting a war against microbes with DDT powder and blunt directives. The humiliation had been real, but the intent had been something she, as a nurse, could grudgingly understand: preventing the spread of disease. One afternoon, as Akiko was helping to distribute water, Sergeant Miller approached her. He held out a small canvas-bound book. "The captain said you were a nurse," he said, not meeting her eye. "Thought you might—" "I don't know. It's a field manual. In English." Akiko took the book. It was a U.S. Army medical guide. She looked from the book to his face. For the first time she saw not just a guard, but a man, tired and far from home. "Thank you," she said in English, the two words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. He just nodded and walked away. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the compound, Akiko opened her small hidden diary. She did not write about hatred or fear. October 5th, 1945, they stripped us of our clothes and we expected the worst. Instead, they gave us a lesson in preventative medicine. They feared a typhus louse more than they hated us. There is a strange logic to it. This is the new war, I think. Not of bullets, but of policies and procedures. We are no longer a threat to be eliminated, but a problem to be managed. They did not attack our bodies with weapons, but with chemical powder and clinical inspections. In a way, the humiliation feels deeper, for it was so impersonal. It is one thing to be a hated enemy. It is another to be a potential vector for disease. I do not know which is worse. But I am alive, and for now, that must be enough. She closed the diary, the American medical manual resting beside it. The war was over, but the struggle to understand its meaning and her place in its aftermath had only just begun.